BBC Radio Scotland.
It's 1932, and Glasgow's central station is heaving. The train has been eagerly anticipated, and the crowd has swelled by several thousand, causing mayhem for the police. Stepping into this maelstrom is a heavy-set American with the air of a southern gentleman. He bows politely to the crowd and twiddles his tie in an exaggerated comic gesture of shyness. Behind him, a thin, red-headed figure emerges from the train and blinks in awe at the assembled throng. Tears begin to brim in his eyes. "Are you okay, Stan?" Oliver Hardy whispers to his companion. "Of course I'm okay, babe," he replies, his voice choked with emotion. "It's just... this is like coming home." I'm Alex Norton, and this is the story of the son of a theatre manager who came to Glasgow to learn his trade. This is the story of a man who left the city an unknown and returned one of the most loved comedy stars on the planet. This is the story of Stan Laurel's Glasgow. Stan Laurel was born Arthur Stanley Jefferson in the northwest English town of Ulverston in 1890, the second child of 5, and, in a foreshadowing of his future travels, the family home was on the aptly named Argyle Street. His father, Arthur Jefferson, or AJ as he preferred to be called, was a respected actor, playwright and theatre manager who was constantly on the road tending to his growing empire. His mother, Margaret, Madge Metcalfe, was herself a stage actress of some renown, and so young Stan's early life was steeped in the grease paint traditions of vaudeville. At the turn of the century, Glasgow had dozens of theatres, including the Theatre Royal, the Metropole and the Panopticon, or as it was known locally, the Pots and Pans. Walking from the Tron Gate at Glasgow Cross back along Argyle Street, so much of this part of the city hasn't changed. Certainly one of Stan's familiar sights would have been the Tron Clock in Glasgow's Argyle Street, beyond which stood the Panopticon Theatre.
There would be a lot of performances. You would have an early house and you would have a late house, and that would go on quite long into the night. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Irene Maver is a senior lecturer in history at Glasgow University and the granddaughter of a couple of music hall tons.
There would also be matinees, so you could have the experience of working in a show for 3 times a day, and that could be often 6 nights a week. Uh-huh. So it was a hugely pressurised business.
Would an artist, for example, maybe start off in Glasgow and then tour around Scotland in a series of theatres?
And again, that's to do with the development of transport in Scotland. Clearly, you have the railways from the mid-19th century. That had a dual effect in that it brought more English companies north of the border, but it also meant that around Scotland that Scottish artists could tour the length and breadth, and that was a staple of the theatrical profession. That's what my grandparents did. They were based in Glasgow, but they went across Scotland. They went to Dundee, they went to Edinburgh, they went south of the border to the north of England as well. So that was the kind of circuit that was well known, and again that would be hard work travelling from area to area on a week-by-week basis.
Sure. This transitory life meant Stan being sent away to boarding school, something which he loathed. His father's work had taken the family firstly to Bishop Auckland, then to North Shields, and finally to Glasgow. How would Glasgow have looked to Stan Laurel as his family arrived in 1905?
For one thing, Glasgow had twice as many people living in it as it has today, so it was a very busy city. But in some respects, where we are now wasn't all that much different. Still a working class part of the city. That clearly would have been of interest to Stan and his family, because there was a ready audience for the theatre.
Yeah, and is that the reason why there have been so many theatres around this area? Because people just needed entertainment, they needed to get away from the drabness and the kind of grinding poverty of their own lives?
Absolutely. people could walk at night to a whole host of different performance venues.
But apart from all the theatres, what were the other entertainments available at the time?
Professional sport was taking off in a big way, especially from the 1880s. You get the rise of the old firms, Celtic and Rangers, but there's a whole host of other football clubs in Glasgow. You have boxing, freak shows, you have fortune tellers. I believe my great-grandmother told fortunes at the Glasgow Fair. It's something that attracts the working classes of Glasgow. So you have that culture where you have, for instance, the early forms of cinema that appeared at the Glasgow Fair. Then the cinema in the 1890s, it's absorbed into variety shows.
I wonder if young Stan, when he went on there at the Panopticon, would have been influenced by film, and he could probably never realise that one day that would have been his
he would
destiny.
Have been one of the greatest stars of Hollywood, so I think that's a really interesting connection to make.
Settling into life in Glasgow's south side, 15-year-old Stan moved to his latest two schools, Rutherglen High, followed shortly by Queen's Park Secondary. But Stanley was not cut out for the life of an academic. Willie McIntyre and Bill Crouch, both Scottish members of the Sons of the Desert, the Laurel and Hardy Appreciation Society, explore Stan's school days.
We are the sons of the desert, having the time of our lives.
Well, Willie, here we are at 17 Craig Miller Road in the south side of Glasgow, in the Battlefield area, outside a nice red sandstone building. That building was probably built not that many years before Stan actually came and lived here.
Yes. Stan Laurel and his Jefferson family lived in the Glasgow area, and Stan at that time went to the school just a few yards down the road. It's no longer a school, it's now a hospital. We'll go and have a look at the place.
Well, here we are, Willie. We're walking the walk that Stan would have done each day going to school. That's the days he did go to school, because I believed he wasn't a very keen pupil. Would that be correct, Willie?
Yes, that seems to have been the case. He wasn't a very good pupil. It was even worse perhaps when he was in Bishop Auckland in the northeast of England. And when he suddenly moved up here, he brought his truancy with him. He used to trudge off to school very unenthusiastically and sometimes be diverted and decide he'd take the day off and go fishing in the River Cart. Fishing, incidentally, was something that he really enjoyed right through to his adult age.
Now, these would have been the school rail. Do you remember
Yes,
that
that's
photograph? 1911.
Yes.
Taken from Battlefield Road of the school.
Yes.
And there were kids hanging over the railings, and the railings are still here,
Yes.
which is now part of the hospital's car park.
Yes. There's a story that when Laurel and Hardy came back on one of the tours, and I think it was a 1947 tour, that Stan Laurel came of his own volition, visited the school and gave out sweeties to the pupils. I wonder what school would have been like for Stan. He obviously didn't like it because he played truant so often. I think he was probably afraid of it and found it rather boring. He'd certainly be rather going fishing or just wandering about with some of his pals. He used to try and keep on the best side of his teachers by trying to ingratiate himself when he went back to school by giving them free tickets to his father's Metropole show, and that certainly worked.
So how would Stan have come across these complimentary tickets, Willie?
Well, Stan worked in the box office at his dad's theatre, so it's quite easy to grab a hold of the stamp and run off a few of these tickets for his teachers.
When his father, AJ, received thank you notes from Stan's teachers for the complimentary tickets, the gig was up. Reluctantly, he withdrew Stan from school and put him to work full-time at the Metropole. Inadvertently, though, he had given Stan the perfect position to not only learn the ropes of the theatre, but to secretly work on his own act. Inspired by his hero, the stage comedian Dan Leno, and the success of boy comedians such as Nipper Lane, Stan practiced his jokes and perfected his costume, all the while wondering when, and more importantly where, he would ever get a chance to perform. Stan knew his father wanted him to follow in his footsteps and become a theatre manager, so would never let him perform on the stage of the Metropole. But luckily, there was a man who would be willing to take a chance on an untried youngster at one of Glasgow's greatest music hall theatres. His name was Albert Pickard, and his theatre was the Panopticon. I'm standing now outside the Britannia Panopticon, and I can't believe the changes that have been made to this building since I first saw it. And I can look at it now. They've cleaned the paintwork. It was all painted tatty blue when we saw it, and now it's been cleaned back to the original stonework. There's been all these wonderful kind of cherubs and angels and things put back on. There's two huge lights that I think are just like the original ones would have been. Two big lights outside the main doors. But the place looks probably even better than it did originally. You know, it would have been a lot dirtier looking when Stan was there. But you can see the whole building now for what it was. It's a beautiful piece of Glasgow architecture, apart from being a historic theatre. Well, now this is a part of the place that clearly hasn't been restored for some time here. This is really ancient, isn't it? Look at this, fantastic. And there's a door open here that leads into the magic of the actual theatre. My gosh, look at this. And here we are. We pass from this stairway that could be in any Glasgow tenement, and we walk through a door and we're in a magical world. We're actually in the Panopticon here, the Britannia Panopticon. Because I should explain maybe, but this was the Britannia Music Hall, and then when Pickard took it over, he called it Pickard's Panopticon. And my old uncle Billy, who was on the halls, who told me about this place, called it the Pots and Pans. Did everybody notice the Pots and Pans?
Well, it was actually the boys that started calling it the Pots and Pans, because 1/3 of the audience were boys aged between 9 and 13. Panopticon, too big a word, they couldn't understand it, so they just abbreviated it to Pots and Pans. And so commonly it became known as the Pots and Pans.
That's such a Glasgow thing, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look at the Clyde Auditorium. Nobody knows what you're talking about. That's the armadillo.
Exactly, yeah. Judith Bowers is the project founder for the restoration of Pickard's Panopticon. Now, it wasn't always a theatre, was it?
No. In fact, the footprint of the building dates back to the mid-18th century, at which point we have it listed as artisan cottages and warehousing.
Before it was the Britannia,
Yeah.
what was it used for?
Well, it was just for
A
warehousing.
warehouse.
But, of course, we're talking about Glasgow warehousing, and the merchants would show off their wealth with having very opulent showrooms within their warehouses. Very grand spaces, a lot of them. Not just warehouses as we would think of today as storage units.
And do you know what happened? I mean, how did it come from being obviously a successful warehouse into being transformed into this theatre?
Well, really it was because by 1857 the population of Glasgow was seriously starting to explode, with all of the people coming to Glasgow to work in the factories and the mills and the shipyards, etc., this huge industrial capital, the workshop of the world. But of course they needed to be entertained. And they liked to go to the pub when they finished work. And of course, in the pub, you'd have a few drinks. And what happens when you've had a few too many drinks? You discover talents that when you're sober, you're unaware of. And really, this is what this building is. It's Victorian karaoke originally. You'd drink in the pub downstairs, and then you would come up here to be entertained. And it was very... Music hall is a thing that has disappeared from our lives now, from the point of view of the music hall audience wouldn't sit patiently and watch like we do in the variety theatres and ordinary theatres today. They would participate vociferously a lot of the time. And of course, boys would wee off the balcony, men would throw rivets, women would throw fish heads and fish guts in the early
hang on a
days.
minute. Men would throw what?
Rivets, shipyard rivets, nails, rivet punching, screws, whatever they could find free at work, they would stuff their pockets with and hurl at the act. And Britannia was known for leaving no turn unstoned. It was just absolutely full of an audience that wanted to vent, really, if you like.
Albert Pickard obviously transformed this place from the Britannia into his own image, into the Panopticon. What sort of a man was Pickard?
I think you would call him eccentric. Although I think that with Pickard, he actually genuinely wasn't eccentric. I think he used eccentricity as a publicity device.
He was a showman, wasn't he?
Oh, he was inspired by the greatest showman of them all, P.T. Barnum.
The story about Stan asking Pickard if he could perform here.
Yeah.
Do you think Pickard saw that as actually helping out his friend's son? Because he knew Stan's dad, didn't he?
Yeah, he knew A.J. Jefferson quite well because, of course, A.J. was the manager of the Metropole round the corner on Stockwell Street. And yes, I think he was just giving his friend's son a little opportunity and probably being a bit naughty too.
This was to be a huge night for Stan. A pivotal moment, not just in his life, but a night that would change his relationship with his father forever. I'm standing here in the wings of the Panopticon, where Stan would have stood trembling with fear, waiting to go on for the Go As You Please night with a fairly wild audience. Now, I know what it's like because I've stood in the wings on a first night waiting to go on, and by and large, they've been fairly well-behaved audiences. But Stan must have heard this raucous noise from the audience and the tongues that had gone before him getting pelted with rivets or whatever they were throwing at them. And then, finally, he gets announced.
Now, settle down, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. All right, now, come on now. For our next turn, it's a very special young man you're going to meet now. It's his first time at the Panopticon, and I want you to make him feel very welcome, ladies and gentlemen. And he wants to be known as Stan Jefferson, he of the funny ways. Stan Jefferson, ladies and gentlemen. On you come, Stan.
That's it. That's Stan's cue. And he walks from the wings, as I'm doing now, onto the stage. And he's blinded because there's footlights, there's spots from the front. You cannot see the audience. All you can see is this black hole in front of you. And there's a silence because they're waiting to see what this lad's going to do. And Stan's got his act in his head. He's rehearsed it, and he starts with his opening patter. And it may have been a song because apparently he paid somebody to write a song for him. He paid £6, I think. And he started with his song, and the audience, according to Stan, gave him a reasonable reception. They weren't as bad as it could have been. He certainly didn't get pelted, so he must have been pretty good if he didn't get a rivet bouncing off his head. But he managed to get through the act, and at the end of it, when he took his bow, the top hat fell off. And as he went to get it, he inadvertently kicked it into the pit, into the band. And he panicked. He tried to get off, and as he went off, either he tripped over the tailcoat or a hook caught in his tailcoat. It's something, I think, according to Stan, it was a hook. And he tripped, and the whole thing went, he tumbled and got the biggest laugh of his act. As he bent forward to pick up the hat, he could see beyond the footlights, and for the first time he saw the audience, and he locked eyes with his father, A.J. In Simon Luvish's book, Stan and Ollie, The Roots of Comedy, Stan's father, A.J., tells of the blossoming performer he was proud to see that night.
Very soon, Stan's number, billed as an extra turn, went up. On he came, wearing a pair of baggy patch trousers, new trousers of mine, cut down, patches added, and also my best frock coat and silk hat. He did his act, the details of which I cannot now remember, and he got a very good reception and scored a genuine success, finishing up to loud laughter and applause, and even shouts of encore. The shouts brought him back, and he beamed a now popular Laurel smile, but in bowing his acknowledgements, he spotted me.
Stan, meanwhile, had fled the stage, and as he recounts in A.J. Marriott's book, Laurel and Hardy, The British Tours, he wasn't sure what sort of reception he'd receive.
I removed my makeup and rushed back to the Met to hide from my father's wrath. But he was already there. He called me into his office, where for what seemed like several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, he glanced at me and said, "Not bad, son, but where on earth did you get those gags?" Fearfully, I told him the whole story and waited for the storm to burst. Slowly, he rose to his feet. "Have a whiskey and soda?" he asked quite casually. At first, I could not believe my ears, but when it dawned on me, I seemed to grow 6 inches in as many seconds. My boyhood was behind me. Dad was accepting me as a man. Then I did the silliest thing. I burst out crying. Putting his arm around me, he led me into the theater bar, and with eyes glistening, introduced me to his friends as my son Stan, the new comedian. Was I proud? I still think it was the greatest moment of my life.
AJ had to accept that his son Stan had show business in his blood, and given the fact that his older brother Gordon was already involved in the management of the family theatres, Stan was finally free to pursue a stage career. AJ wrote Stan a letter of introduction to Levy and Cardwell, producers of a pantomime, Sleeping Beauty, which was touring the UK throughout 1907. Stan embraced the chance to play some real roles, and it would be on this trip that he would find his natural talent for comedy. Things were on the up, and Stan was slowly learning to become a proper stage performer. With everything going his way at last, Stan's world was rocked by a huge blow. On the 1st of December 1908, just days before Stan was due to go on tour, his mother, Madge Metcalf Jefferson, died. Madge had been the rock of the family, and although she'd lived in the shadow of her entrepreneur husband AJ, she had not only raised his children, but acted in his plays, aided him in the management of his theatres, and advised him on every aspect of his business. Her most important part, wrote her Glasgow obituarist, was Olga Snake in the bootblack, in which she excelled, and beautifully gowned made an imposing appearance. Her husband attributes much of his early success to her artistic taste, as well as her business tact. And here, in a quiet corner of Glasgow's Cathcart Cemetery, in an unmarked grave, is Madge's last resting place. Like any mother, she was a huge influence on Stan. She gave him a strong sense of humility, which, in turn, would give his on-screen relationship with Oliver Hardy such a ring of authenticity. After the funeral, it was thought the best thing for the children would be to go and live with Madge's sister Sarah Ann, or Auntie Nant, as Stan called her. As the younger children settled in, Stanley had to swallow his grief and set out on tour once again. His mother's death changed Stan's life in 2 very important ways. Ironically, it gave him a greater sense of family that he'd often felt was missing. Auntie Nant's house became a busy, homely refuge from life on the road. It also became the point when young Stanley felt he had finally grown up. This, he thought, was his time to go out into the wider world and make his mark. By the winter of 1909, Stan had toured in a variety of productions and had just come off the back of rave reviews for his comic role of P.C. Stony Broke in a play called Alone in the World. Finding himself back in Glasgow, Stan set off for a meeting here in the Theatre Royal with a man who would take his career to a level that Stan could only dream about. He was the legendary impresario Fred Carno, and in A.J. Marriott's Laurel and Hardy, The British Tours, Stan describes that first meeting.
I presented my card with the request for interview and was promptly ushered to the stage, where a gentle-voiced little man came forward to meet me. "Well, Mr. Jefferson, Jr., he said, what can I do for you?" I told him I wanted to see Mr. Carno. "You're seeing him right now," he replied quietly. I explained I wanted a job as a comedian. "Are you funny?" he asked. I told him of my youthful experience. He nodded. "Very well," he said. "I'll try you out at £2 a week. Report to Frank O'Neill, who's running my Mummingbirds company in Manchester. Push yourself forward, and I'll see you in London in a few weeks' time."
Stan blurted his thanks and staggered out of the door onto the streets of Glasgow. Finally, he'd achieved the ambition of every budding comic. He was one of Fred Carno's comedians. But there was a bigger surprise waiting in Manchester for Stan. A twist of fate that would throw together 2 of comedy's greatest ever performers.
I was given a small part to play, but before I could make my first big entrance, I received a setback. The wardrobe mistress told me, "There's a new comedian just joined from one of the other companies. He's taken over the part of the drunken swell. I haven't a suit to fit him except the one you're wearing. So I'm afraid you'll have to take it off and hand it over. Reluctantly, I removed the suit and took it along to the new comedian's dressing room. I found him to be a pleasant fellow with dark curly hair, blue eyes, very white teeth, and a friendly smile. I took to him right away, and in the course of time we became close friends, rooming together on tour. His name? Charlie Chaplin.
So in 1909, Stan joined Carnor's army and went touring the UK as understudy to Chaplin. He'd come a long way from the truant skipping lessons at Queen's Park Secondary School, or the nervous youth pacing at the side of the panopticon stage. Carnor would take his troupe to America in 1910, where the budding silent movie industry in Hollywood would give both Stan and Chaplin the opportunity to build huge, internationally famous careers. But Stan never forgot living in Glasgow, or how life-changing the time he'd spent in the city was. Those tears in his eyes, back in 1932 in Central Station's concourse, were tears of genuine joy as he returned in triumph to the city where his legend began. So remember, the next time you wander from the Tron Gate, along Argyle Street into Merchant City, that you're walking in the footsteps of genius, that you're walking around Stan Laurel's Glasgow. The final word really should go to Stan and Ollie themselves, and here they are in a rare recording they made during that whistle-stop tour of 1932. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Mr. Oliver Norval Hardy and his good friend, Mr. Stan Laurel, he of the funny ways.
I'm so happy to be here with you tonight in London, Scotland.
Oh, that's done it. No more speeches.
What do you mean, no more speeches? We've got to do something.
All right. Maybe I can sing a little song.
That's a good idea. Oh, say, that reminds me.
What?
I wish I brought my piano with me from America.
You don't have to bring a piano all the way from America. There's plenty here.
I know, but I wish I'd brought mine.
Now, why in your wildest dreams do you wish you'd brought your piano with you?
Well, you won't be mad at me if I tell you, will you?
Oh, no. You know I couldn't really get mad with you.
No, I'd rather not tell you. I'd rather...
Oh,
no, I'd rather...
Come on now. Why do you wish that you'd brought your piano with you?
Well, I left our return tickets lying on top of it, and I couldn't
Stan Laurel's Glasgow was presented by Alex Norton. Lewis MacLeod starred as Albert Pickard, A.J. Jefferson and Stan Laurel. The programme was written and produced by David Flynn for BBC Radio Scotland.